Support comes from the Wiregrass Archives at Troy University's Dothan campus, identifying and preserving historical documents and photographs for research related to the Wiregrass region. More information at troy.edu/wiregrassarchives.
From Troy Public Radio and Troy University, in partnership with the Alabama World Affairs Council, this is Speaking Globally, and I'm Walter Gavan. Welcome back to Speaking Globally, where we look at the history, politics, and culture of different regions and countries around the world and talk with people who can provide context and insight into some of the most important global issues we face. Early this month, Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire in Gaza. The agreement brings a tenuous peace to a region racked by 2 years of war, the latest armed clash in a conflict whose roots stretch deep into a long history of wars and crises. Here to help us put the ceasefire into context is a seasoned veteran of diplomacy in this complex arena, Ambassador Richard LeBaron. He is currently a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs, focusing on the Gulf and on broad social change in the Middle East and North Africa region. He is a career diplomat with over 30 years of experience abroad and in Washington. His most recent overseas posting was as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in London. Previous to his assignment to London, Ambassador LeBaron served as the U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait from 2004 to 2007. From September 2001 to July 2004, Ambassador LeBaron served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of the United States in Tel Aviv, Israel. Ambassador LeBaron was Minister Counselor for Political and Economic Affairs at the Embassy of the United States in Cairo, Egypt, from 1998 to 2001. Welcome to Speaking Globally, Ambassador LeBaron.
Good to be with you, General Given. It's a pleasure. I was with you in person a while back at the Alabama World Affairs Council and so enjoyed my time with you and your audience there. It was a fun and interesting event.
We certainly enjoyed hosting you, and the membership continues to rave about your presentation, and I'm happy to have this opportunity to bring it to a wider audience through our podcast, Speaking Globally. There is, of course, never any shortage of things to discuss in the Middle East, and we will get to the exciting current developments shortly. However, I always like to ground our conversations here in history. You have wide experience in the Middle East, having served at 4 U.S. embassies in the region and worked on U.S. policy in Washington. Your career began just shortly after the Camp David Accords. Would you briefly describe for us the significant major events since 1978 that have shaped the landscape we see today?
Well, I think one of the most significant was the Camp David Accords. Right before I came into the service in 1978, they were signed. I entered the Foreign Service in 1979. And this was the first establishment of a peace treaty between an Arab state and Israel, a former enemy, a former combatant, actually been in wars with Israel. And this proved, and this is an important thing, it proved that Arabs and Israelis can sign peace treaties and can end conflicts and can figure out ways to coexist. That peace remains a relatively cold peace. It's not full of cultural activity. There are less back and forth between citizens of those two countries than people would probably prefer. But it's important because that was the biggest enemy, the largest military force opposing Israel. And that peace treaty is a huge element of Israel's security. Over the years, we've seen other attempts at peacemaking. In the 90s, there was a bilateral peace treaty between Jordan and Israel, another neighbor, an important peace treaty. Jordan and Israel have had quiet relations before that time, but the peace treaty sealed those and has been maintained until today. And that's also, an important protection of one of Israel's borders. The Madrid peace process was another important outcome after the first Iraq war. Baker and Bush put together the Madrid peace process, which brought together Israelis and Palestinians, as well as the broad international community in support of peace in a multilateral peace process. And that process pretty much thrived in the mid 90s. People tend to forget that there was a successful peace process at that time, but it faltered over the fundamental question of lack of progress on the Israeli Palestinian file. I mean, the whole multilateral aspect of it was designed to support that Israeli Palestinian negotiation, which ended with extremist violence on both sides. You'll recall the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, beginning of the second intifada or the first intifada, and that the peace process after that basically disappeared for a long time. So those are a few of the highlights. I won't cover all of the ancient history, but I think it's important, as you say, and if you don't mind, I'll call you Waldo. If you call me
Please,
Rick,
please.
okay. And it's important to recall that this is President Trump's efforts are not the first time that administrations have attempted to make historical agreements. It's not the first time that great ambitions have been expressed about the direction of things. And we should be prepared for the ups and downs that always come after the initial euphoria of signing a peace treaty.
Now that we've brought up Gaza, let's begin to unpack that catastrophe, beginning with the attack itself 2 years ago. What was Hamas's intent in launching that surprise attack?
Well, that's hard to say because we don't have much visibility into their thinking, but my interpretation was that they wanted to make sure that the Palestinian cause was on the front page around the world and was not slipping from the world's attention. And they wanted to prove they were a potent force and could attack Israel. It's hard to say, but I don't think they expected it to be as much of as large an operation as it turned out to be. And that was partly due to lack of Israeli preparedness. So it became a very extensive and ugly event, and it required a major reaction. But it accomplished the purpose of Hamas, which is a purpose of a terror group, is basically to bring terror, which draws attention to a political cause. In that sense, Hamas has won, in the sense that Hamas is at the negotiating table regarding these agreements. Hamas has won. Doesn't mean these victories are huge victories, and they came at the cost of huge destruction and death in Gaza. But it does mean that Hamas remains, despite the 2 years of relentless attacks upon them, Hamas remains a force to be dealt with in Gaza.
If we look at the immediate reactions, Hamas perhaps achieving more success than it had hoped and certainly more impact through its attack, the Israeli reaction which followed, some have argued perhaps was disproportionate, that the Hamas attack, bad as it was not ultimately an existential threat, and that the Israel's response perhaps went too far. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think this was an example of not inept leadership, but leadership that didn't really provide the kind of leadership needed at the time. I mean, the leadership in Israel portrayed this attack as an existential threat to Israel. It was never such a threat. There was no chance that Hamas would be able to do more immediately. There was no second wave. There was no march on Jerusalem. There was never a question that Israel retained a hugely disproportionate forces against Hamas forces. So this attack was shocking to Israel, and it really put the Israeli population into a state of trauma. And frankly, the Israeli leadership did not help its population understand the trauma, understand the scale of the threat, and understand what responses would be appropriate. And this was tied up, of course, with a prime minister who was embattled internally and whose reputation is based on the security of Israel. So it was a witch's brew of internal politics, of external threats, of terrorism, of hostage taking, which traumatized Israel. And the leadership of Israel then decided that its best reaction would be to exercise massive retaliation. And I can only guess that the intent was to demonstrate to the Palestinians the huge price to be paid by allowing Hamas to operate, in some hope that the Palestinians would turn on Hamas, but also just a element of vengeance, an element of playing to Israeli popular opinion, an element of not knowing what else to do, and certainly an element of having no plan once you completed military operations. So we saw this play out. And I don't think anybody, Waldo, I don't know about you, but I don't think anybody would have said after the attacks 2 years ago that the Israelis would still be involved in military operations 2 years later. It just seemed to me that this might go on for a year, but it didn't seem at a certain point that there was any further justification for destroying the infrastructure, for killing civilians, for rocketing hospitals. I mean, this was disproportionate force, and there were probably war crimes involved, and there will be some reckoning to be done at some point within the Israeli military, and I'm sure the international community will be thinking through how to deal with this as well.
Well, it's certainly the trauma that this inflicted upon Israel, there's no denying how significant that was, and all of us who were following events certainly recognize that, and that in one way it seems that the response too was grounded in a sense of we have to do something to actually make up for what was, in many ways, unpreparedness for what Hamas was doing. I mean, Hamas showed ingenuity in their attack and really probably succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, what they were accomplished. So I think, too, there was this sense that, we've got to make up for really not doing our job or being ready to do our job in protecting our population.
I think there's certainly an element of that, and it still hasn't been explored in the after action reports and commissions that should be looking at that. There's clearly Israel was unprepared. Clearly Israel was depending on technological monitoring that was not adequate. Clearly they were ignoring some of their own soldiers who saw activity on the border. They actually saw rehearsals for this kind of an event. It was a bias that was built into the IDF at the time that Gaza was, being run by Hamas, but Hamas had no further ambitions to terrorize Israel, even though, there had been, rocket attacks regularly over the several years. So it's an interesting study in military blindness and where you put your emphasis on dependence on technology. But I think part of the problem is since the war drug on, there have been no real analyses of this, no real accountability. A few people have resigned their posts over the last couple of years, but you have a prime minister who's, it was on his watch, and there's no sign that this prime minister intends to take any part of the accountability for what happened during his watch. I think he will just try to move on as if he had no part in this basic security breakdown that occurred.
After 2 years of bloody conflict, there is finally a ceasefire and the exchange of hostages has taken place. Some observers say that's the easy part. What is your assessment of the viability of the agreement and the willingness of the players to take the next steps?
Well, I think you're right. The ceasefire and return of hostages, return of prisoners, is a movie we've seen before. It's a movie the Israelis and Palestinians are quite familiar with. So, although it's extremely important that it happened, given the devastation that was continuing to take effect or occur and the continuing horror of hostage holding, I think it is absolutely a essential, but absolutely only a first step. And the next steps in implementing the agreement will be extremely important and extremely difficult. We are looking at things like inserting, for example, an international security force to maintain security in the Gaza Strip. The chances of that being an unadulterated success are zero. There will be elements within Gaza, including Hamas, which may or may not want this force to succeed. Hamas currently has a monopoly on armed power in Gaza. It will be very difficult to see them willingly giving that up, and they may give it up in a tactical way in certain phases of the agreement and then rebuild later, quietly. It will be interesting to see how the Israelis react because provocations by Hamas could, of course, be used as justifications for the Israelis to come back and exert force themselves. We need to remember that Israeli forces withdrew to an agreed upon line a couple days ago, but they still control 53% of Gaza. So they're still there, and they're still close and able to exercise options there. So it's not exactly, it is not a full withdrawal, and they will be watching very closely and, could seize upon any justification to exercise their options of self-defense. As you know, Waldo, from serving in the Middle East, the Israelis jealously guard their freedom of operation. They are not interested in international forces for the most part. And unless this international force is extremely effective, the Israelis will be looking for its weaknesses and using those as justification for slowing down other phases of the agreement if they see any evidence of violations by Hamas or others. And there always are going to be rejectionists on both sides. There are going to be people in Gaza, and they aren't all Hamas. There are some people that are much more radical than Hamas who will want to see this agreement fail, who will have no sympathy for an agreement that leaves the Israelis in Gaza at all, who will use that as a justification for attacking them, perhaps. And the general population, of course, which has been devastated. I mean, more than 75% of the structures in Gaza have been destroyed. Schools have disappeared, 90% of the schools, 95% of the hospitals, according to some figures. I mean, this creates an environment of sustained poverty in Gaza and lack of services that will not quickly be replaced, and the bitterness will persist among the population, not just among Hamas, but among the hundreds of thousands of people who will be affected by the difficulty of daily life. and they will not blame Hamas, I don't think. I think a few of them will, but they will look at this destruction and see the Israeli hand in it, I fear, and not make the connection with Hamas's provocations. So this is a long, difficult haul, and it's not just the technical steps that need to be taken, which are numerous and complicated, but it's also the political environment in which they take place on both sides and the ability of people to work constructively together to get it done.
Another area where that will be especially important is something that's described in the agreement as, and I quote, Gaza will be governed under the temporary transitional governance of a technocratic, apolitical Palestinian committee responsible for delivering the day-to-day running of public services and municipalities for the people in Gaza. That sounds like a heavy lift. Can you imagine exactly how that's going to work?
It's an extremely heavy lift. It's going to be extremely difficult to find the right people and convince them that this is a job they want, because they'll be under constant danger. They'll be under constant scrutiny. Their attempts to fix things will be constantly hindered by both the scale of the problem and the many actors that have to be involved in order to get it done. So it's going to be an extremely heavy lift and will require a lot of support from outside actors. I think that support will be there. I don't know how much and how long. And one of the interesting things about this agreement is the direct involvement of the Qataris, the Turks, United Arab Emirates, the Egyptians. This has not always been the pattern for peacemaking between Palestinians and Israeli. Israelis have long preferred, as has the United States, largely in deference to Israel, that the negotiations between Israel and Palestinians be direct. And now you have a lot of other actors, some of whom are sympathetic to Israel, some of whom have mixed feelings or ambivalent about Israel policies, who will actually presumably be on the ground with stabilization forces and will be involved in reconstruction. We cannot count on the Israelis to pay for anything. There's no indication from President Trump that we are going to contribute to reconstruction. I mean, foreign aid has been something that he has run against, not something that he would talk about, something the United States would do. I mean, during all of his declarations over the last 3 or 4 days, while he was in Egypt and in Israel, there was no talk of a huge U.S. commitment to reconstruction of Gaza. So I think the expectation, as it often does, is the money is going to come from the Gulf, maybe a little bit from Turkey, but who knows? But the Gulf, has the resources, whether they have the staying power to operate in this highly politicized situation, whether they can sort through their own differences. For example, the UAE is extremely allergic to the Muslim Brotherhood, and anything they see is a trace of it, and they put Hamas in the Muslim Brotherhood category, whereas Qatar is more, I would say, more open to dealing with Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, and has been, of course, a mediator. So you've got a lot of different things going on, but reconstruction and coming up with the funds and the logistical plans and the ability at the same time to take care of a population who basically has no resources, it's a tall order. I don't want to be pessimistic because clearly it has to be done. And clearly the Gazans have going for them a sense of resilience that is almost hard to believe. But it's going to be a major effort over multiple years, and we'll have to see if that's within the capacity of a small group of countries to carry out. The Europeans want to be involved also, and I think they will be, but that will be mainly financially and some aid. But I don't think they'll be in a position to put people on the ground in great numbers.
We've really focused on Hamas, a non-state actor with a political role. But let's expand that a little bit. What about Fatah and the Palestinian Authority? We haven't heard much about that except the possibility that they might be involved in some way in the governance of Gaza.
Well, that's part of the notion. There's no real love lost between West Bank Palestinians and Gazans over the years. And so a large insertion of people from Fatah into Gaza will not be an easy sell. I think the effort at this point will be to see if you can train up as many Gazans and so forth to help with the security forces and so forth. But there is a notion that the Palestinian Authority does have legitimacy, regardless of the Israelis' constant attempts to undermine that legitimacy. There is, at the same time, a lack of effective leadership within the Palestinian Authority, which basically reflects Fatah. And it's a huge lift for an organization that is barely able to sustain itself on the West Bank in the face of internal difficulties as well as constant challenges from Israel, and the constant challenges of settlement activity and illegal extremist attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank. So it's again, we'll see where this comes from, but assembling a group of technocrats sounds like a simple technical task. It's fraught politically and economically, and we'll see how it goes.
Looming at the end of all this, as it seems to always in any major discussions, is the vision of a Palestinian state, which is briefly alluded to in the agreement in general references about, and I'm quoting again, a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. Mm-hmm. What would that look like? And is there even a remote possibility that Israel would allow it?
Well, there's two things there. There's the credible pathway and there's a Palestinian state. I mean, the current Israeli political climate would not agree to a Palestinian state, but there's not one on the menu, so it doesn't matter. The pathway is important, and we've called these things pathways before. We've had other terms for them in the past, but there's always an element of pathway, and it starts with security. It starts with security for Palestinians and security for Israelis. You need a sustained period when neither population feels threatened. And this is especially important for the Israelis because they have the ability to intercede militarily at any point if they feel threatened. So, you have to see an end of terrorism, virtually an end of terrorism. You have to see some element of responsible leadership among the Palestinians. You have to see the notion that there are not going to be militarized groups within the Palestinian territories, Gaza or the West Bank. And then you can go from there. And so I think that pathway, it's important to talk about it. It's important, I think, to keep a Palestinian state on the horizon. It's important that the United States recognizes that, because the United States, in my view, was drifting away from the notion of support for two-state solution. And I think this administration, I think it was nudged back in that direction by cooperating with Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE to maintain some hope for such a prospect. I think if the Israelis and the U.S. had been negotiating this agreement bilaterally, we would not have seen any mention of a Palestinian state. And this takes me back to a broader point of this agreement for Gaza involves Arabs on the ground in an area close to Israel, other Arabs, not Palestinians, other Arabs on the ground close to Israel, involved on a day-to-day basis in this process. They not only see what's going on, but they become more significant actors in what's going on. And that has it has the potential for danger in the sense that they will be targets and could withdraw if they are. But it also gives, in a sense, more hope that international attention will stay focused on this pathway, and that's important. It doesn't become simply a matter of whether the Israeli internal political system tolerates a Palestinian state. It also becomes a subject of international concern, just as, the recognition of a Palestinian state by some European powers and others had no practical impact, but in my view, had some symbolic impact of saying to the Israelis, we are looking at this issue. We are not abandoning it. It's going to be on the agenda. You cannot ignore it. You cannot pretend like it's never going to happen. So that's important. Prospects of a Palestinian state within 5 years, I would say, are zero. The prospects in 10 years, if everything goes right, 50%. So I won't go beyond 10 years. I've already gone too far.
Yes, the horizon tends to be short for what the art of the possible is in the region.
Right.
Before we conclude, I would like to talk more strategically about our own State Department and public service. When I served as the senior military official at the State Department, I was consistently impressed by the expertise, experience, and professionalism of the staff and the diplomatic corps. I viewed it and continue to view it as an important strategic asset for this country. These days, though, I worry it is being taken for granted and diminished without an understanding of what it does for the country. This was your area, so I'd ask you, do you share those concerns on the current situation relative to our ability to conduct our foreign policy and international relations?
I absolutely share those concerns, and I think this administration has made it very clear that they do not view the State Department, much less USAID, which they summarily destroyed, as an effective tool of foreign policy. They view it as the enemy or the hidden state or whatever they call it, and that has resulted in destruction in these organizations. I mean, they call it reform sometimes, but you don't reform an organization by firing everybody. You go in and you see what you want to reform and you change it. The State Department should be much, much more active and much bigger than it is. I mean, it's a pitifully small organization given the challenges in the world. It's an organization that has loyalty to every president and swears, loyalty to the Constitution. And when you join the Foreign Service, you know you're going to be working for some presidents you don't like and some presidents you might prefer. But you work for them equally hard because that's what you came to the game to do as a public servant. And I don't think there's any understanding of that that's demonstrated by this administration. So that worries me. And I think they may find that they're going to need more help than they counted on as things move ahead in this Gaza file and other files. I noticed that they're deploying 200 troops from CENTCOM to Israel to help monitor this agreement. But it would be very useful to have some people who understand the dynamics of moving goods from one place to another. USAID experts, for example. Be good to have some diplomats on that staff who understand the importance of watching exactly how the Israelis are reacting and what they're doing and what the trends are, and reporting on that to commanders and State Department senior officials. But I think so far the approach has been very personalized. It's people who the president trusts, but the president is just going to have to trust more people if he intends really to bring about the broad vision of Middle East peace that he has enunciated. And this goes far beyond Israel and Palestine for him. It goes to the whole region. That's a big order, and he's going to need all the help he can get. So I hope he recognizes that and repairs some of the damage that has been done.
Richard, you're an American treasure. I want to thank you again for your service to this country and one of the hardest places to serve in the Middle East. Your insights have helped us to understand what's going on today, and we're better for it. Thank you very much for joining us today on Speaking Globally.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you, and call me anytime.
My guest today has been Ambassador Richard LeBaron. Take a moment to share this podcast with a friend, and be sure to subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. Speaking Globally is recorded in the studios of Troy Public Radio on the Troy University campus and is produced and edited by Austin Toy with help from Kyle Gassett. I'm Walter Gavan, and I look forward to talking with you again soon on Speaking Globally.